Now, we will begin the second section with the theme of COVID-19 and changes in international order. I'm Gwang Nam, Director of the Center for Taiwan Studies of Asiatic Research Institute and the moderator of this section. I got a PhD in political science from Korea University. My research areas are unification in Korean Peninsula, diplomacy, and North Korea. Thank you for participating in the second section. As the first presenter and debater of this section, I would like to introduce Professor Jae-Sung Jeon, who is a professor of Seoul National University, and Professor Ping-Kri Chun, who is a professor of National Jeongchi University.
Hi, this is Jae-Sung Jeon, teaching international relations at Seoul National University. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk today. Today's topic is the U.S. rivalry and the transformation of international order in the period of COVID-19 crisis. Today I will talk about what is the problem of the current international order which accelerated the rivalry, not cooperation among great powers. What did happen when the relationship between the United States and China during the COVID-19 crisis? What is the situation regarding the U.S.-China rivalry in the post-COVID-19 crisis is the third subject. Fourth, how South Korea has been influenced by the U.S.-China rivalry during the COVID crisis. First, what is to be noted with the global response to the COVID-19 crisis is that there is a severe lack of international cooperative response to the COVID-19 crisis, either bilateral, unilateral, or multilateral. It is true that as all countries face unexpected and common problems, they expected an international response centered on World Health Organization, that is, WHO. During the COVID-19 crisis, China has voiced the need to cooperate with the U.S. Some voices in China emphasized cooperation between the United States and China based on the past record that the United States and China made extensive cooperation amidst health conditions such as AIDS, SARS, and 2009 U.S. flu. However, there are voices of regret and criticism that if China had responded more transparently and effectively in the early days, it would have prevented the global pandemic. There was also such an expectation as the United States has always demonstrated its leadership in most global issues and has provided international global public goods. Collective responses and close policy coordination would happen among states, especially between U.S. and China. However, the result was not the same as we expected. The United States is still the country with the most confirmed cases in the COVID crisis and has many problems in solving its own problems. During the corona crisis, we faced critical awareness of the system and governance of the United States and other Western developed countries. It is true that as a world hegemonic state, there existed various aspirations to imitate the liberal democratic system of the United States. Overall, the evaluation of the U.S. system changed negatively as we witnessed the situation in the U.S. and the reality of the U.S. medical system. It is not only disappointment about President Trump's policy. It may lead to criticism of the overall U.S. system. More seriously, the U.S. criticized China as the originator of the crisis, mishandling and diffusing the virus. Washington even expressed the view that the crisis might weaken China in favor of the U.S. in the midst of rivalry. Watching China respond to the crisis has led Americans to abandon their likings for China to some degree. The United States has tried to change the US-China competition into an ideological one, that is, the competition of liberal democracy governance versus authoritarianism. And the Trump administration has been making efforts to settle it into a new Cold War. On the other hand, there are evaluations that the authoritarian model of China is more effective as they face the corona crisis despite the rise of human rights issues. Then next, what's the context of the COVID-19 crisis in terms of the US-China relationship? This crisis can be seen as an event in the course of strategic competition between the US and China, going to the competition for supremacy or hegemony. China already surpassed the US in terms of purchasing power, in terms of gross domestic product in 2014. And it is estimated that if it continues to grow around 6% in the future, it will overtake the US in the 2030s. Although it is much behind the US in military power, it is promoting rapid military modernization. The degree of satisfaction with the current international order led by the US is increasing, and efforts are being made to demonstrate leadership in international organizations such as the United Nations. China is trying to establish its own sphere of influence that exclusively applies China's standards and norms within a certain limit through bilateral relations, which can be seen as the beginning of the role of providing hegemonic order with public goods. Such efforts have appeared to some extent during the former crisis under the US unipolar system, namely the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the 2008 economic crisis. At the time of 9/11, China's national power was far behind the United States, so it showed support for the US-led global war on terrorism. During the 2000 economic crisis, the US-centered financial system was criticized. China wanted the renminbi internationalized. Also, economic support was provided by China for countries suffering from economic crisis such as Europe. In addition, it was pointed out that the US economic model has a serious problem and that China has the ability to resolve the crisis through the so-called Beijing Consensus. However, the model to overcome the crisis proposed by China was also based on the development model of the authoritarian system. Therefore, the international community does not view China as having hegemonic power and authority. Although the COVID-19 crisis was an opportunity to confirm the elements of the hegemonic competition in the US-China strategic competition, it was clear that the US will respond more actively to China's pursuit of a hegemony. China has tried to show off its ability to resolve the crisis and tried to provide public goods related to international health, such as medical equipment and economic package for countries suffering from the corona crisis. In this process, China showed an intention to partially replace and supplement the hegemonic leadership that the United States lacks. However, it faced criticism that China's support policy was linked to the expansion of influence and that efforts to provide public goods were politicized, and also that China's internal structure of international governance was not transparent and even hierarchical. The United States has failed to exercise hegemonic leadership after the corona crisis for various reasons. While the course of overcoming The 9/11 terrorist attacks and the 2008 economic crisis was based on an emphasis on alliances, use of international multilateralism, and emphasis on the ideational cause of the United States, such as human rights and democracy. The corona crisis was consistent with its own interest-based policy and a policy to hold China accountable. Nevertheless, the corona crisis triggered a systemic effort to thoroughly limit China's challenge to hegemony. As China's leadership emerged more clearly in the health crisis, with high international visibility, the U.S. reorganized the existing U.S.-China relations from the basic to a certain level of disharmony, reestablished a new network centered on the U.S., and checked against the expansion of China's influence. It began to spread and showed that China's lack of transparency in the current crisis was an important basis for justification. Then what is the prospect for the U.S.-China relations from now on? As the corona crisis and the U.S. presidential election overlap, several shortcomings of the United States, which have exercised global leadership, are becoming more apparent. Above all, the corona crisis was an event that more clearly demonstrated the U.S. dependence on China's economy. Not only was it revealed that the U.S. was heavily dependent on China for its production and supply chain of core medical equipment, but it also became clear that U.S. economic growth was generally linked to China. As China's economy contracted rapidly after the crisis, the U.S. industries, which relied on Chinese raw materials and intermediate goods, also faced great difficulties. Although it was inevitable due to the outbreak, it was a situation where the U.S. vulnerability was further revealed if China used the interdependence as a weapon for the strategy toward the U.S. In fact, the concept of decoupling is not a very clear concept. Decoupling may mean many things. For example, first, realistic recognition of the results of excessive interdependence and a sudden and total economic disconnection between the U.S. and China. It may mean reducing dependence on core materials such as medical equipment. Or third, it may mean decoupling of cutting-edge technology, for example, provisions and sanctions on the export of semiconductors by the U.S. companies to the public. Fourth, decoupling of norms between the U.S. and China in international laws and norms in the field of high-tech security. And further, it could mean a policy of frustrating Chinese economic growth as a general. It is necessary to clearly recognize what the purpose of the decoupling that the United States is currently pursuing and in what order and scope it is pursued. Above all, a complete separation of the U.S.-China economy is virtually impossible, and many views predict that partial and realistic recoupling will occur. In fact, it is almost impossible for many U.S. companies to withdraw from China completely. Also, it is not clear whether EPN means just a free trade regime excluding China, like the former TPP negotiations, or just banning the transfer of sensitive technologies to China, or excluding China from investment and production networks and establishing a new supply chain. In addition, it is expected that there will be a backlash when the U.S. requests the participation of allies and partners without a vision for a mid to long-term plan. Other countries may be able to participate when the United States creates a normative network and offers an alternative to China's geopolitical retaliation. In particular, in the case of allies, a safety net alliance that provides the mechanism for a safety net against Chinese retaliation, rather than a simple security alliance, should be created to establish a public network. We can talk about cautious optimism as well. The rivalry became worse because the foreign policy of the Trump administration weakened the U.S. capability and intention to act as a global hegemon to provide global public goods. But there is still a belief and trust that U.S. will revitalize the so-called liberal international order which the United States established since 1945. Without mutual cooperation with China and with the prospect to maximize the relative gain coming from the crisis, two countries will continue to conduct competitive approaches not just against each other, but to other international actors as well. While short-term and realistic changes in circumstances are insignificant, there is a possibility that long-term changes in perception will occur and lead to changes in reality. Now the situation reveals the impending risks from many other sources as well. There are risks caused by globalization, and there is a growing need to go for the governance of international cooperation, international collective leadership, rather than the U.S. or China's sole hegemony. If there is a recurrence of a health crisis, such as the corona crisis or economic crisis, or refugee crisis or environmental degradation caused by a very rapid globalization, there is a possibility that a stronger voice of international cooperation will emerge from the lesson of the failure of the corona crisis. Since the strategic competition between the US and China has a great impact not only in the two countries, but also around the world, it's important how the response of other countries in the international society will proceed. The COVID-19 crisis has reinforced awareness of the imperfection of the U.S. leadership, the deficiencies of China's new leadership, and market shortage of public goods in other powers as well. Furthermore, it is said that the huge problems facing humanity at present, such as economic inequality after globalization, political polarization worldwide, environmental degradation, globalization of diseases and risks, and refugees, all make it difficult to solve only with the hegemonic leadership of one country. When global governance in the future is raising a sense of crisis, South Korea also faces the risk of great power competition very seriously. What South Korea aims is that South Korea should minimize damage in the short term, presents a vision for the new global governance in the mid and long term. Also, South Korea needs proactively engage with various interactions issues pursued by the US and China, presenting norms and principles-based responses. As a middle power, it's important to present a new vision beyond the limits of US-China leadership in the long term. We need to pay attention to the concept of global governance surrounding the changing nature of international politics and the collective and cooperative production of global public goods. If there is one good thing about COVID-19 crisis, we came to realize that we need an active, multidimensional dialogue among great powers, especially between the US and China, with the inclusion of many middle powers which can present a new view of cooperative global governance. Thank you very much.
Briefly comment on Dr. Chung's presentation, US-China rivalry and transformation of international order in the period of COVID-19 crisis. Now, I have a few thoughts about Dr. Zhong's presentation. First of all, I think it is very correct to point out that um, the COVID-19 crisis has been secularized, right? I think this is something that constructivist literature really help us to understand how a group of people and states actually begin to find out and evaluate external threat. And COVID-19 crisis, it did not begin as a global crisis, and gradually it became something that raises a sentiment of nationalism and xenophobia. So I think this is something that we all have to recognize, and it is important guiding the international politics today. Next, I think rivalry between U.S. and China. You can say that it has grown a long time ago, right? U.S. and China was never really friends. They were really never really strategic partners. Actually, the term strategic partnership means that there are a lot of differences that needs to form a partnership, needs to form dialogues to address. So I think another thing that Dr. Chong mentioned is that the problem of U.S. hegemonic power. I think it is right that the U.S. economic power has been overstretching for the last decade when they launched a counterterrorism war. However, I think the same can apply to China. All right, if you look at economic power and if you look at military power, China has become more confident about its economic development as well as its military development. So China, I think right now it is one of the players in world politics and one of the most important players. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, Chinese leaders, Chinese elites would never say that they are part of this great power competition game. Right now, Chinese elites believe that China not only is a great power, it is participating in this great power competition game, and it has the competence to prevail in this game. So we have seen China reaching out and trying to expand its economic influence for the past few years since the launch of Belt and Road Initiative. We have seen some military expansion, especially in South China Sea, more recently in Taiwan Strait. So does the India-China Chinese border clash count? Partly, I would say. I think this is not something that Beijing intended to do, but it happened. Long thing short, I think China is also overstretching its capability as well. It is not yet a hegemonic power, but it is trying to act like a superpower, like a hegemonic power. This is, of course, might be detrimental for China, but China has a good reason to do this, especially after the COVID-19 crisis. So this trend, can it be stopped? I would rather take a more optimistic view about China's behavior in the future, because China right now it is still trying to trying to get rid of COVID-19, right? If the global pandemic calm down, maybe we will see a more rationalistic China. At least this is what I would predict. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As the second presenter and the debater of this section, I would like to introduce Professor Ping-Hui Chen, who is a professor of National Junction University, and Professor Gi-Young Son, who is a professor of Asiatic Research Institute. Professor Ping-Hui Chen is in charge of both presentation and discussion in this section.
Hello, I'm Ping-Hui Chen. I'm an associate professor at National Junction University, Department of Diplomacy, Taipei, Taiwan. This is a panel about COVID-19 and changes in international order. So speaking of international order, I will mainly focus on U.S.-China relations for the past few months. So it is no doubt that U.S. and China relations is at its low point right now. We have witnessed a lot of coercive threat and retaliation for the past few months. So the sign of recovery of the relations is still very thin. We have no reason to be very optimistic that their relations will ameliorate soon. So what does this confrontation between U.S. and China tell us about international order, and how does it relate to COVID-19? I think this is what I'm going to talk about today. So if you look at China's coercive behavior, especially coercive diplomacy, things over the past decade, you would quickly notice that China has been more willing to use coercive diplomacy after COVID-19 outbreak. This is particularly true after COVID-19 spread to Middle East, Europe, and then North America. As the global pandemic crisis emerges, China became very nervous because it wanted to avoid being blamed upon. It wanted to get rid of the responsibility of causing the pandemic. So China thinks this is a harmful thing to its reputation. So its foreign policy started to become very aggressive in order to protect its reputation overseas. So over the past few months, we have seen the Chinese diplomats become more aggressive on the international stage. We have seen a lot of languages that usually diplomats will not use. And what does that tell us about U.S.-China relations? First of all, we have to recognize there are a lot of differences, disagreements between U.S. and China for the past decade. And they are trying to solve it by using coercive threats, especially from President Trump's side. The thing is, a lot of disagreement between China and the U.S. are economic oriented. For example, intellectual property theft, the trade balance issue, China's role in the WTO, China's role in WHO, China's Belt Road Initiative and how it can leverage political interest overseas. These are all important issues that they should discuss about. But as more political issues add in after the COVID-19 crisis, The U.S. support to Taiwan, the U.S. support to Hong Kong, the U.S. concern on Xinjiang, or the U.S. helped to build up arms in Japan, the U.S. deployment in South Korea. These all became issues that would make China and U.S. relations more tense. Now, right now, it has become more and more difficult to separate economic issues from political ones. So once the relations deteriorates, um, those issues that's supposed to discuss and negotiate upon become unimportant. They cannot address those issues at this point of time, simply because there are too many frictions between each other. So if you look at the trade deals they reached in January, that's supposed to gradually solve their differences on economic ties, but that deal is currently on hold, and there's no sign that it will come back. So right now, it became more difficult to negotiate anything with China right now, because China would be so sensitive to and hook up every political issues with non-political one. So you see, China is more willing to use coercive language in actions against other countries. Speaking of which, we have to recognize that China is more likely to use coercive retaliation or coercive move against U.S. allies rather than the United States itself. Well, China has a history of using coercive move against U.S. allies. They were more likely to punish U.S. allies instead of confronting the great power such as the United States. This is not new, but this is something we have to keep an eye on, because the U.S. allies are more likely to be threatened by China. If you look at the recent cases of Australia, it shows that China is willing to issue threat and fulfill threat using by unannounced economic warfare, economic statecraft. But in the meantime, I think we can observe that in China's move, in China's retaliation, we can see that China is not trying to escalate the conflict. If you look at how the U.S. closed down a Chinese embassy in the U.S. and China closed down U.S. embassy in China, and China could have chosen a more important, a bigger U.S. consular office, but it didn't. So there are signs that it didn't want to escalate conflict. The same applies to U.S. allies as well. If you look at Australia's case, when China launched the unannounced economic sanction against the barley exported by the Australians, barley is not certainly the most important export, nor does the Australian wine. They can hurt Australia, but they are not the key issue here. They are not the key products in the economic statecraft. So we can say that China does have some restraint. By the way, Australia punished simply because it supported an investigation, a cross-national investigation against the origin of COVID-19. So you see, this China became very defensive over the past few months. And at least this is what is Chinese political elites believe. They believe that China, the world rushed to blame China for the COVID-19 pandemic, whereas China should not be blamed for that. Okay, and China is capable enough right now to defend its own interest. So China is going to defend it using its own newly acquired economic and military capability. So of course, this is not a good sign because China is more and more willing to use coercion. Um, so to be honest, if you will look at the dispute between the U.S. and China, you see that sometimes the U.S. punishment on China, the U.S. accusation on China is not very legitimate. Okay? It is clearly that U.S. has some hidden political agenda directed toward domestic politics. So, for example, the recent deal about TikTok purchase, that's one reason. So China would believe that the U.S. is using excuses, national security concern, to confiscate China's Chinese companies' effort, and China needs to respond to that. So this is a vicious circle, to be honest. I think this kind of accusations and retaliations do not really bring resolution. They're not really bring solutions to U.S.-China's economic problems. There, as I said, there are a lot of problems needs to be solved, but they simply did not try to focus on those problems. So that's something that needs to be addressed. It is undeniable that COVID-19 has a important effect on rising nationalism in different countries, and U.S. and China are no exception. The rising nationalism in both countries are making leaders more and more difficult to make concessions, to show tolerance, and to reach out other countries through diplomatic channel. So this is not a good development, especially in a world when great power competition become more real. Speaking of great power competition, this is important phrase in today's news, but we need to look closely to great power competition these days. How is it different from the past decade or past 2 decades? The U.S.-China competition, is it a rivalry competition? Is it going to be a rivalry competition? I think this is a question that IR scholars need to answer. One thing I can contribute here is that we are still far away from a Cold War-like great power competition. I want to point out one fact is that there is no bloc competition right now. There's no bloc politics right now. China has not created a bloc of its own. And in the nearby future, China is not likely to create its own bloc. Indeed, China tried to build economic ties with surrounding countries, especially with friendly countries. And it seems like they can form some kind of integrated bloc between it. But China, unlike the Soviet Union, are not likely to offer defense commitment to its surrounding countries. So it's still early to say that we are in a superpower competition, just like late 1940s Soviet and the United States. What do we have here? What do we have great power? What do we have about great power competition? We have two important important countries who are willing to use its own military and economic capability to coerce each other in order to try to prevent the progress or development of the other. I think this has important implication here. So even though it is not a rivalry yet, but the competition, the sense of competition, will make these countries more likely to restrict their interaction. Here, I want to point out that the U.S. is trying to slow down China, maybe, but we have to recognize that China did not make its success by its own. China's success, in fact, built on the U.S.'s effort as well. So, in a globalized world, China and the U.S. both realize they actually need each other to prosper. So, the reason Chinese behavior acts more like we are strong enough, so we don't need to follow the order created by the United States. But the question is, what kind of orders China prefer? If you look closely, what China wants, the answer might be China wants the U.S. to not target at China, right? But it's hard for the U.S. to make concession on China on several important issues I talked about before. So if we want to be optimistic, we need to hope that the two powers will sit down and negotiate and discuss their differences. The worst case scenario is that they will have militarized conflict somewhere in Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. There is a possibility. Especially when the COVID-19 brings up nationalism in two countries. This is something I want to point out. Okay, I think the time is almost up. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Professor Ki Young-son, Asiatic Research Institute, Korea University. First of all, I enjoyed very much Professor Chun's presentation about the changes in the international order. So perhaps this session is mainly about the changes of international order coming after the COVID-19 epidemic. And I think Professor Chun made a really good summary of the current power competition or great power competition between United States and China, highlighting China's coercive diplomacy and the rise of nationalism, and also sometimes comparing it with actually the Cold War situation. Basically, Professor Chun concluded that still we have a long way to reach the point of the Cold War, because mainly he mentioned the United States and China are unable to create a block of satellite states. And perhaps, if we look at the nature of the competition, the military dimension is relatively weaker than the economic dimensions, as we can witness in the current trade war between United States and China. And also, I agree with the Professor Chun's view that U.S.-China need each other, especially because of China's competitive advantages and the demand within the U.S. market. basically without actually Chinese goods and products, it's really hard to satisfy American consumers. It is definitely different from the nature of the Cold War, in which United States and the Soviet Union somehow launched very fierce competition in a state in which their economies are almost decoupled from each other. Nevertheless, Professor John's presentation is not very clear about what impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will bring about this power competition. I think that despite the rise of nationalism and China's rhetorical aggressiveness and assertiveness, both the United States and China are increasingly forced to prioritize handling their domestic issues rather than focusing on power competition. I think the United States will have to pay more attention to current internal problems caused by the failure in controlling the spread of COVID-19. Also, the deepening, slowing economic activities in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. Compared with the United States, China is really performing excellently. If its economic growth in the second quarter, it's really remarkable. So in a sense, if this trend goes on, then perhaps the economic gap between United States and China will be narrowed in a relatively near future. Some experts say maybe in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, Chinese GDP will reach the level of the United States. But if this trend continues, perhaps the point in which China will surpass the United States will come very soon. And also, what I think is United States need to pay more attention to its internal political affairs, especially after the violences following police brutalities against African Americans, and also the reactions by these African American communities. Somehow United States has been regarded as a society which has been very much successful in terms of multiculturalism. But now, we can clearly see the division between different ethnic groups in the American society. So perhaps United States, whether who is newly elected in the forthcoming presidential election, the president need to pay more attention to domestic affairs. And also China will have to rearrange perhaps its domestic industries, exhibiting weaknesses in the face of American imposition of sanctions, looking very close to an effort to demolish China's industrial and manufacturing bases, especially in the digital sector. So perhaps the Huawei is a current target of all kinds of sanctions and penalties by the United States. Perhaps more Chinese companies will face similar challenges. Therefore, China need to rethink about its industrial policies and strategies, and therefore, I think it will take time for China to rearrange its domestic industrial bases rather than focusing on power competition with the United States. And therefore, coupled with the American presidential elections and the possibility of lengthy policy reviews, if, for example, Biden wins, then the US-China competition will slightly subdue in the future. So in my opinion, when we discuss the international order, it's not really appropriate to focus only on the power competition between United the States and China, we need to discuss, the attitude and policies of the other great or secondary powers such as Russia, India, and perhaps Germany or the European Union. Since it's impossible for the United States, China to build a block of satellite states, as mentioned by Professor John, the policies and strategies of the other great or secondary powers, sometimes even the choices of middle and small powers, will be crucial in determining the future of the international order. So in this sense, this is a joint international conference between many, experts from many countries, especially if we look at this issue from the South Korean perspectives or Taiwanese perspectives. I think how these actually, in a sense, middle powers handle the power competition between United States and China will have really far-reaching, consequences on the future of international order. Basically, it's a matter of, in a sense, how these secondary or middle powers to react to the initiatives or coalitions of great powers like United States and China. So depending on the policy choices, the nature of power competition will be completely different. What I mean is, in the current international or regional order, many middle-sized countries or small powers are taking what we call hedging strategies. Rather than siding with either with the United States or China, many countries are actually trying to look at both United States and China. So depending on their national interest, they want to basically intensify cooperation either with the United States or China. So I think we need to pay more attention to the attitude of the other, small or middle-sized countries, rather than just focusing on the United States and China. And in this sense, the international order of the 21st century will be very much complex and complicated. It is not like the Cold War rivalries between two rival blocks. I think there will be, in a sense, many great powers, many secondary powers competing, but at the same time cooperating. Therefore, we need to take some actions to, in a sense, to strengthen the, economic or industrial basis of, each country's, rather than relying on diplomatic, strategies. What I mean is, basically, we need to sometimes think about self-reliance, but at the same time, we need to think about forming alliances or alignment with like-minded states. In this sense, I think the order of 21st century will be much more fluid. Therefore, we need to, in a sense, strengthen our efforts to securely analyze the changes of international order, and especially when we are preparing for policy choices of each country. And that's all. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello, I'm Ping-Hui Chen. So thanks for Dr. Song's comments. I have a very quick response. I think Dr. Song correctly point out that domestic policies are more important, and both China and the U.S. will try to deal with those domestic problems instead of focusing on foreign policy disputes. And I agree with it. And I think both states have very serious internal issues. So, given the magnitude and difficulties they both face, and the efforts they need to spend to fulfill domestic political interest, I think we should pay more close attention to whether those states will have diversionary incentives to provoke foreign policy dispute in the future. But I want to add that the World War diplomacy of PRC in recent months is not a evidence of diversionary tactics. It is indeed a worry of Beijing that its reputation can be damaged by the spread of COVID-19. So PRC was eager to reestablish its reputation in different countries, even by doing a very aggressive diplomacy. And I think it's true. China has begun to adjust its industrial development policy. And China has begun to do so since the trade war began. So far, I think it is still unsuccessful. We cannot see that China will be able to replace its import of computer chips from other countries, including the United States. But China is heading this way. China will continue to invest vast resources into its tech industry and try to reduce its reliance on US-based R&D or US-based products. So in the future, I think we will see some changes in China's industrial policy. And I think Dr. Sung is absolutely right that middle power behavior is crucial in 21st century. And when I say China is not able to make a block, I must also emphasize China has not shown the intention to build a block. But whether China can build its own block depends not on China, but also other middle powers, middle power that matters in this region. So if the current tension with China persists, I think the US allies and US partners in Asia, such as India, Vietnam, they will try to think about how they balance the relations between China and the US. They will bargain with the US and try to set up their own China policies. So Korea, Japan, and Australia will cooperate with the US. That is no doubt. But they will also try to minimize its damage with the relations with China when it comes to siding with the United States. In this regard, I think Taiwan is a special case. I think Taiwan has less room to maneuver between China and the US, simply because Taiwan is too reliant on US military protection. And this protection is still uncertain, given that we don't have a treaty. So all in all, I think the order of the COVID-19 pandemic, the order after COVID-19 pandemic, will be, like Dr. Song said, very fluid, very unpredictable. And I think we all agree that the coming U.S. presidential election matters a lot. So we will see how U.S. will maybe adjust its policy against China. I don't think the U.S. will totally decouple from the policy right now. But if Biden wins the election, we will see some small adjustment when it comes to U.S. American-China policy. Thank you.